At Thanksgiving dinner, my daughter-in-law left a card on the table. Family trip. Clean the house before we're back. Even the nanny went along. I simply smiled. When they returned and their keys didn't work in the door, my daughter-in-law fainted. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I should have known something was wrong when Heather insisted on setting the table herself that Thanksgiving morning. In the 10 years since David Thompson married her, she'd never shown interest in domestic duties. She always left those tasks to me while she lounged in the living room, scrolling through her phone or barking orders about how the cranberry sauce wasn't the right shade of red. But there she was, at 8 in the morning, arranging the porcelain dinnerware with unusual precision. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect bun, not a strand out of place, and she wore that ivory sweater that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She kept glancing at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of expression that reminded me of a cat watching a mouse. "Linda, honey," she said in that sickly sweet voice she used when she wanted something. "Why don't you focus on the kitchen? I'll handle the dining room today." I nodded, wiping my hands on my apron. At 66, I'd learned to pick my battles with Heather. The kitchen was my domain anyway, where I felt most comfortable preparing the Thanksgiving feast I'd been making for decades. The same recipes my mother taught me, the same traditions I'd passed down to David when he was small. The turkey was golden brown, the stuffing perfectly seasoned, and the sweet potato casserole bubbling in the oven just the way David loved it. This was supposed to be my day. The one time of year when the whole family gathered in the house that had been my home for 45 years. The house where I'd raised David after his father died, working 2 jobs to keep us afloat, sacrificing everything to give him the life he deserved. David arrived first, with the children Sophie 11 and little Ethan 8. They ran to me with genuine excitement, their faces lighting up when they saw me. Sophie hugged my waist tight. "Grandma Linda, we missed you so much." Those moments made everything worthwhile. I held them close, breathing in their innocence, their pure love that asked for nothing in return. They didn't care that I wore the same dress I'd had for 6 years or that my hands were rough from years of work. They just loved me. "I missed you too, sweetheart," I whispered into Sophie's hair. "Go wash up. Dinner will be ready soon." Heather's parents arrived next, followed by David's Uncle Robert and his wife. The house filled with chatter and laughter, the kind of warm chaos that reminded me why I love the holidays. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel that familiar warmth of being surrounded by family. We gathered around the dining room table, the one I'd bought with my first Christmas bonus 22 years ago. David sat at the head, looking handsome in his button-down shirt, though I noticed the stress lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when he was younger. Heather positioned herself to his right, her posture perfect, her smile radiant as she played the role of the perfect wife and mother. I took my usual seat, the one closest to the kitchen, so I could jump up to refill dishes or grab forgotten items. It had become my designated spot over the years, though I couldn't remember exactly when that happened. "Before we say grace," Heather announced, her voice carrying that theatrical quality she used when she wanted to be the center of attention. "I have a little surprise for everyone." She reached under her chair and pulled out an envelope cream-colored to match her sweater. Her fingers were perfectly manicured, a fresh French manicure that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. "It's a family announcement." She continued, her smile growing wider. "David and I have been planning something very special." My heart skipped. Were they expecting another baby? Moving closer, the possibilities raced through my mind as she opened the envelope with deliberate slowness, clearly enjoying the attention. She pulled out a card, expensive cardstock with elegant lettering, and held it up for everyone to see, but she was looking directly at me as she read it aloud. "Family vacation to Key West, Florida, 11 days of sun, sand, and relaxation. We leave tomorrow morning, and we'll be back December 5th. The table erupted in excitement. Sophie and Ethan cheered. Uncle Robert congratulated David on the generous gesture, and Heather's parents beamed with pride at their daughter's good fortune. But Heather wasn't finished. She reached into the envelope again and pulled out another card. This one smaller. Her eyes never left mine as she slid it across the table toward me. And this one is for you, Linda. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the card. The silence around the table was deafening as I read the words printed in that same elegant script. House-sitting duties. Deep clean all rooms. Organize closets. Tend to plants. Expected completion by December 5th. Thank you for your service. The word swam in front of my eyes. Service. Like I was hired help, like I was the maid. Not the woman who had raised the man sitting at the head of this table. Not the grandmother of the children who were now looking at me with confusion. I don't understand, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Heather's smile turned predatory. Well, someone needs to take care of the house while we're gone. You don't mind, do you? I mean, you practically live here anyway, and it's not like you have anywhere else to be. The casual cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow. Uncle Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Heather's mother looked down at her plate. Even David seemed stunned, though he said nothing to defend me. Even the nanny Kate is coming with us. Heather continued, her voice light and cheerful, as if she were discussing the weather. The kids are so excited to have Kate along. It'll be like one big happy family vacation. One big happy family without me. I looked around the table at the faces I'd known and loved for years. Some avoided my eyes. Others looked genuinely uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. No one said this was wrong. No one pointed out that I was being treated like hired help in my own home. Grandma Linda. Sophie's small voice cut through the silence. Aren't you coming with us? Heather answered before I could. Oh, sweetie, Grandma Linda is too old for vacation. She'd much rather stay here and take care of the house. Wouldn't you, Linda? The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could feel everyone waiting for my response, waiting to see if I would make a scene, if I would ruin their perfect Thanksgiving dinner. I forced my lips into what I hoped resembled a smile. Of course, I managed to say, I'll take good care of everything, but inside, something fundamental had broken. As the conversation moved on to vacation plans and travel arrangements, I sat there holding that card, reading those words over and over again. Thank you for your service. 45 years in this house. 45 years of sacrifice, of putting my family first, of swallowing my pride and my dreams to make sure they had everything they needed. And this was how I was repaid, with a house-sitting assignment, while they paraded off to paradise with the nanny Kate. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. I smiled when expected, nodded at appropriate moments, and cleared dishes like the good little servant they apparently thought I was. But something had awakened inside me, something that had been sleeping for far too long. As the family said their goodbyes and made their final vacation preparations, I retreated to the kitchen to clean up. The card lay on the counter where I'd left it. Those elegant words mocking me in the overhead light. Thank you for your service. I read aloud to the empty room. The words tasted bitter on my tongue. But as I stood there, surrounded by dirty dishes and the remnants of a feast I'd prepared but barely enjoyed, a thought occurred to me. A thought that should have scared me, but instead filled me with something I hadn't felt in years. They had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The house felt different the morning after they left. Not peaceful, I'd expected that, but hollow, like an abandoned theater, where the last performance had ended badly. I stood in the kitchen, still in my robe, staring at the coffee maker as it gurgled to life. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silence. They'd left at 5 a.m., bags stuffed into David's SUV like they were fleeing a crime scene. I'd watched from my bedroom window as Heather supervised the loading, pointing, and directing, while David did the heavy lifting. Even little Ethan had his own rolling suitcase, bright blue, with superhero stickers. The babysitter Nanny Kate had climbed into the front passenger seat, my traditional spot on family trips back when I was still considered family. Heather had knocked on my door before they left, not waiting for permission to enter. She'd stood in my doorway in her perfectly coordinated travel outfit, designer sunglasses perched on top of her head even though the sun hadn't risen yet. "Remember, I want the house spotless when we get back," she'd said, consulting a list on her phone. "The master bedroom needs deep cleaning, and those guest room closets are a disaster. Oh, and the baseboards in the living room are dusty. I noticed yesterday." I'd nodded from my bed, pulling the covers up to my chin like a child hiding from monsters. She'd looked around my room, then taking in the modest furniture, the faded family photos on my dresser, the stack of library books on my nightstand. Her expression had been one of distaste, as if my very existence offended her. "Try to make yourself useful," she'd added before leaving. "It's the least you can do." Now, hours later, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, that insulting card still lying where I'd left it. "Thank you for your service." The words had kept me awake most of the night, echoing in my head like a broken record. I'd raised David in this kitchen, fed him breakfast every morning before school, helped him with homework at this very table, celebrated his victories, and comforted him through his defeats. When he'd brought Heather home for the first time, 10 years ago, I'd welcomed her with open arms, so grateful that my son had found love. How naive I'd been. The changes had been gradual at first. Subtle suggestions that maybe I was doing too much for David, that maybe he needed space to grow into his role as a husband. Then came the comments about my cooking, my clothes, my opinions, always delivered with a smile, always framed as concern for my well-being. "Linda, you work so hard," she'd say. "Maybe you should let David and me handle the holiday planning this year." "Linda, that dress is so vintage. Have you thought about updating your wardrobe, Linda?" I think you might have misremembered that story. David told me it happened differently. Slowly, steadily, she'd erased me from my own family. And David, sweet David, who'd once defended me against playground bullies, had stood by and let it happen. I got up to refill my coffee and caught sight of myself in the kitchen window's reflection. 66 years old, gray hair that needed cutting, wearing a robe I'd owned for a decade. When had I become so invisible? The morning dragged on. I tried to read, but the words swam on the page. I turned on the television, but every channel seemed to be showing happy families enjoying perfect lives. Finally, I found myself standing in the hallway outside David's old bedroom, the one Heather had converted into her personal closet and makeup room. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see her designer shoes lined up like soldiers, her handbags displayed on custom shelving like museum pieces. Everything expensive, everything perfect, everything purchased with money from the business. David ran the business I'd helped him start with my life savings. But it was the master bedroom that really got to me. Their bedroom in the house that had been my sanctuary for 4 decades. Heather had redecorated it last year, gotten rid of all the furniture that held memories of my life with David's father. The bed where I'd read bedtime stories, the dresser where I'd kept family photos, the rocking chair where I'd nursed David through childhood illnesses, all gone, replaced with stark, modern pieces that looked like they belonged in a hotel. I sat on the edge of their bed, running my hands over the luxury silk comforter that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. This had been mine once. This whole house had been mine. Was still mine technically, though somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten that fact. That's when I saw it lying on Heather's nightstand. Her jewelry box opened carelessly, with pearls and diamonds spilling out like she had so much wealth she couldn't be bothered to organize it properly. Next to it sat a stack of mail bills and statements that David handled, but Heather liked to review. I shouldn't have looked. I knew that. But something compelled me to pick up the top envelope already opened. It was a mortgage statement for the house. My house. The house my husband had bought 45 years ago. The house he'd left to me when he died. The house I'd never transferred out of my name, despite David's various requests over the years. My hands shook as I read the details. They'd been making payments on a mortgage that didn't exist. For the past 6 years, David had been sending monthly payments to a bank account that Heather had set up thinking he was paying the mortgage on the house. But the house had been paid off 17 years ago. I'd used every penny of my husband's life insurance to eliminate that debt, determined that my son would inherit a home free and clear. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Heather had been stealing from her own husband, convincing him that they needed to make mortgage payments on a house that belonged to me. And David, trusting and naive, had never questioned it. I sank into the chair by their bedroom window, the mortgage statement clutched in my trembling hands. Below me, the garden I'd tended for decades stretched out in the afternoon sun. The rose bushes I'd planted when David was small, the herb garden where I'd taught him to identify basil and oregano, the old oak tree where we'd hung his tire swing, all of it mine. Every brick, every board, every memory embedded in these walls, mine. I thought about that card downstairs. Those dismissive words that had cut so deep. Thank you for your service, as if I were the help, as if I were some distant relative who should be grateful for scraps of attention. But I wasn't the help. I was the owner. I walked to my bedroom and pulled out the old filing cabinet I kept in the back of my closet. Inside, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves, were all the important documents of my life. Marriage certificate, death certificate, insurance papers, and yes, the deed to the house. My name in black ink, clear as day. Linda Grace Thompson, sole owner. I sat on my bed, holding that deed like a talisman. When had I become so afraid of my own family that I forgot who I was? When had I started accepting crumbs when the whole feast belonged to me? The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. I glanced at the caller ID and saw Heather's number. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but old habits die hard. Hello, Linda? Heather's voice was bright with artificial cheer, loud enough that I could hear tropical music and children's laughter in the background, just calling to check in. How's the cleaning going? I looked around my modest bedroom, unchanged for decades, while they'd transformed the rest of my house to suit their tastes. It's going fine. Good. I hope you're being thorough. I left a more detailed list on the kitchen counter. Did you find it? I hadn't even looked. Yes, I found it. Wonderful. Oh, and David wanted me to remind you to water his golf clubs. They're in the garage and the leather needs conditioning in this weather. Water his golf clubs in December in a garage. The request was so absurd I almost laughed. Almost? Of course, I said instead. Great, we're having such a wonderful time. The kids are at the beach with Nanny Kate right now, and David and I are about to have couples massages. It's exactly what we needed, a break from all the stress at home. The stress at home meaning me. I'm glad you're enjoying yourselves. I managed. We are okay. I need to run. My massage appointment is in 5 minutes. Make sure you get those baseboards, Linda. They were really quite dusty. The line went dead. I sat there holding the phone, staring at the deed in my other hand. 45 years of memories in this house. 45 years of love and sacrifice, and putting everyone else's needs before my own. And this was what it had earned me. Orders to clean baseboards and water golf clubs while they lived it up in paradise. But as I sat there in the growing darkness of my bedroom, something shifted inside me. Something that had been dormant for too long, buried under years of making myself smaller and smaller to accommodate other people's comfort. I stood up, smoothed down my robe, and walked to the kitchen. Heather's detailed cleaning list sat on the counter, 3 pages long, written in her perfect handwriting. Room-by-room instructions down to scrubbing behind the toilets and organizing the spice rack alphabetically. I picked up the list, read it once more, then walked to the fireplace in the living room. The fire I'd lit that morning was still burning low, just glowing embers. I held the papers above the flames and let them go as Heather's perfect handwriting curled and blackened and turned to ash. I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not anger. Anger was exhausting and useless. Not hurt. I'd carried enough hurt to last several lifetimes. What I felt was clarity. They thought they were coming home to a clean house and a grateful servant. They were wrong on both counts. I called Harold Miller first thing Monday morning. Harold had been our family lawyer for 28 years, handling everything from my husband's will to David's business incorporation papers. His secretary, Mrs. Collins, recognized my voice immediately. "Linda, how lovely to hear from you." "Harold is with a client, but I know he'll want to talk with you. Can you hold for just a moment?" While I waited, I stared out the kitchen window at the garden. The morning frost had settled on the rose bushes, making everything look crystalline and new. It felt symbolic somehow, like the world was being reborn right before my eyes. "Linda," Harold's warm voice came through the phone. "What a pleasant surprise. How are you, dear?" "I'm well, Harold. I need to ask you something important about the house." "Of course. What's on your mind?" I took a deep breath. If I wanted to change the locks on my property, legally speaking, what would I need to do? There was a pause. "Well, as the property owner, you have every right to change locks, install security systems, whatever you feel is necessary. Is everything all right? Has there been a break-in?" "No break-in, but I want to make sure I understand my rights. David and his family have been living here, but the deed is still in my name, correct?" "Absolutely. We discussed transferring it several times over the years, but you never signed the papers. The property remains entirely yours." "Linda, is something wrong?" I could hear the concern in his voice. Harold had known me since David was in high school. He'd seen me struggle through my husband's illness, watched me work multiple jobs to keep us afloat, witnessed my quiet strength through decades of challenges. "Nothing's wrong," I said, and for the first time in years, I meant it. "I'm just reclaiming what's mine." "I see." Harold was quiet for a moment. "Would you like me to prepare any documentation? Perhaps a formal notice of changes in living arrangements?" "That would be helpful. How quickly could you have something ready?" "I could have papers drawn up by tomorrow afternoon." "But Linda, are you sure about this? I know how much your family means to you." I looked around the kitchen at the cabinet doors Heather had complained were outdated, at the countertops she'd said needed replacing, at the breakfast nook where she'd humiliated me just days ago. My family means everything to me, Harold. That's exactly why I'm doing this. After hanging up with Harold, I drove to town for the first time in months. I'd gotten into the habit of staying home, of making myself smaller and smaller to avoid Heather's criticisms about my appearance, my choices, my very existence. But today felt different. My first stop was Johnson Hardware, where old Pete Johnson had been selling locks and keys for 40 years. He looked up from his newspaper when I walked in, his weathered face breaking into a genuine smile. "Linda Grace Thompson, haven't seen you in a dog's age. How have you been?" "I've been better, Pete, but I'm working on that." I explained what I needed, and Pete didn't ask questions. He just nodded and pulled out his sample book of lock sets, explaining the differences between standard locks and deadbolts, between basic security and high-end protection. "This one here," he said, pointing to a brass deadbolt system. "This is what I'd put on my own house. Solid construction pick resistant, and it comes with 6 keys so you can control who has access." 6 keys. I thought about that as Pete rang up my purchase. 6 keys for 6 people I trusted. Not 6 people I was obligated to trust, but 6 people who had earned it. My next stop was even more liberating. Reynolds Consignment had been on Main Street for decades, run by Martha Reynolds, a woman my age who'd built her business from nothing after her divorce 30 years ago. She looked up from sorting through a rack of winter coats when I walked in. "Linda Grace Thompson, as I live and breathe, what brings you to my little corner of capitalism?" I laughed. Actually laughed for the first time in weeks. "I need to sell some furniture, Martha. Quite a bit of it, actually." "Well, you've come to the right place. What kind of pieces are we talking about?" I pulled out my phone and showed her the photos I'd taken that morning. Heather's precious living room set the one she'd insisted on buying last year, despite my protests about the cost. The formal dining room furniture that no one ever used, except for company because Heather said the kitchen table was too casual for proper meals. The guest bedroom set that stayed perpetually pristine because Heather discouraged visitors. Martha whistled low. "This is high-end stuff, Linda. Where did you get furniture like this?" "It was purchased for my house, but I've decided it doesn't suit me anymore." Martha's eyes sharpened. She'd been in business long enough to read between the lines, and she'd probably heard the town gossip about how Heather treated me. Small towns had few secrets. "I can give you good money for pieces like this," she said carefully. "But are you sure some of these look practically new?" "I'm sure. How quickly could you arrange pickup for furniture this nice? I can have my boys there tomorrow morning if you want." That afternoon, I drove to every furniture store within 60 miles looking for pieces that spoke to me, not to some idealized version of what a proper house should look like, but to me, the woman who'd raised a son in this house, who'd tended gardens and cooked countless meals, and created a home with her own hands and heart. I found a comfortable sectional sofa in soft blue fabric, the kind you could curl up on with a book without worrying about wrinkles. I bought a dining table made of reclaimed wood, scarred and imperfect and beautiful, with chairs that looked like they belonged in a farmhouse kitchen. I selected a bedroom set that was sturdy and simple. Nothing fancy, but mine. The delivery truck started arriving Wednesday morning. Out went Heather's sterile perfection, and in came furniture that invited you to sit, to stay, to be comfortable. I rearranged everything, putting my favorite reading chair by the window where the morning light was best, setting up the kitchen table so I could watch the birds at the feeder while I ate breakfast. But the most satisfying moment came when I hung my photographs back up. The ones Heather had deemed too personal for common areas, the ones she'd banished to my bedroom to make room for her abstract art that meant nothing to anyone. Pictures of David as a baby, of my husband and me on our wedding day, of 3 generations of family holidays and birthdays and ordinary Tuesday afternoons that had meant everything. Each photo went back in its rightful place, reclaiming the walls of my house with memories of my life. Mrs. Wallace from next door came by Thursday afternoon with a casserole and curious eyes. "I saw all the delivery trucks," she said, craning her neck to see into the living room. "Spring cleaning in December, something like that?" I said, accepting the casserole with genuine gratitude. Mrs. Wallace had been bringing me food for months, ever since she'd noticed how thin I'd gotten. She'd never said anything directly, but her kindness hadn't gone unnoticed. "It looks lovely," she said, and I could hear the approval in her voice. "Very you, yes?" I thought as I closed the door behind her. Very me. That evening, I sat in my new living room with a cup of tea and the latest mystery novel from the library. The house felt different now, lighter somehow. The furniture invited relaxation instead of demanding perfection. The photos on the walls told stories instead of trying to impress visitors. The very air seemed easier to breathe. My phone buzzed with a text from Heather. Just a photo of the family on the beach, everyone tanned and smiling, with the caption, "Wish you were here," followed by a laughing emoji. But I didn't wish I was there. For the first time in years, I was exactly where I wanted to be. I deleted the message without responding and returned to my book. Tomorrow, Harold would deliver the papers. Tomorrow, the new reality would begin. But tonight, I was home. Really, truly home, in a way I hadn't been for years. Outside, The wind picked up, rattling the windows and shaking the bare branches of the oak tree. A storm was coming. I could feel it in the air. But I wasn't afraid. My house was solid, built to weather whatever came its way. Just like me. I settled deeper into my new sofa, pulled the soft throw blanket over my legs and smiled. Let the storm come. I was ready for it. I heard the car doors slamming at 10:37 a.m. on Sunday morning. From my position at the kitchen table, where I sat reading the newspaper with my second cup of coffee, I could see David's SUV in the driveway through the window. They were back from paradise, tanned and rested, and probably expecting to find their house sparkling clean and their live-in servant grateful for their return. The front door handle rattled, then rattled again more forcefully. "That's weird," I heard David say, his voice muffled through the door. "My key's not working. Try it again." Heather's voice was sharp with irritation. "Maybe you're using the wrong one." More rattling, the sound of keys jingling of someone trying multiple keys in rapid succession. "None of them are working," David said, and I could hear the confusion in his voice. "It's like the lock's been changed." "That's impossible," Heather snapped. "Who would change our locks?" There was silence for a moment, then the sound of footsteps on the porch coming around toward the kitchen door. I stayed seated calmly, turning the page of the newspaper, though my heart was beating faster now. This was it, the moment of truth. The kitchen door handle turned also locked, of course. "Mom," David called, knocking on the door. "Mom, are you in there? The locks aren't working." I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the taste. Good coffee, the expensive kind I'd always wanted to try, but had never bought because Heather complained about unnecessary expenses. I'd purchased it yesterday along with fresh cream and real maple syrup for my pancakes, small luxuries that added up to a new way of living. "Mom?" The knocking was more insistent now. "Mom, can you hear me?" I folded the newspaper carefully and walked to the kitchen door. Through the glass panel, I could see them all crowded on the small porch. David looking bewildered. Heather looking furious. The children confused and tired from their long flight, and Nanny Kate standing awkwardly to one side with her overnight bag. I unlocked the door and opened it just wide enough to see them clearly. "Hello?" I said pleasantly. "How was your trip?" "Mom, thank God." David stepped forward. "Something's wrong with the locks. None of our keys work." And he stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening as he looked past me into the kitchen. "What happened to the furniture?" I glanced back casually, as if seeing the room for the first time. "Oh, that I redecorated." "You what?" Heather pushed past David, trying to get a better view. "Where's my dining set? Where are my chairs?" "I sold them," I said simply. "They didn't suit me." Heather's face went white, then red, then a mottled purple color I'd never seen before. "You sold my furniture. You can't do that." "That was expensive. It was purchased for my house," I corrected gently. "So technically it was mine to sell." "Grandma Linda." Sophie's small voice cut through the tension. "Can we come in? I need to use the bathroom." I looked down at my granddaughter. Sweet Sophie with her sun-streaked hair and confused eyes. She was innocent in all this, just a child caught in an adult mess. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, stepping aside to let her in. "You know where it is." As Sophie scurried past me, Ethan started to follow, but Heather grabbed his arm. "No," she said firmly. "We all go in together." I raised an eyebrow. "Actually, you don't all go in together. This is my house, and I decide who comes in." The words hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't exploded yet. David stared at me with his mouth slightly open. Nanny Kate shifted nervously from foot to foot. Even little Ethan seemed to sense that something monumental was happening. But it was Heather's reaction that was the most dramatic. Her face went through a series of expressions. confusion, disbelief, rage, and then something that looked almost like panic. "Your house?" She laughed, but it was a brittle, hysterical sound. "This is our house. We live here. We pay the mortgage." I tilted my head thoughtfully. "Actually, you don't pay the mortgage. There is no mortgage. This house was paid off 17 years ago." David frowned. "That's not possible." "I write a check every month to a bank account your wife set up," I finished for him. Harold Miller explained it all to me when I had him research the mortgage payments. Quite creative, actually. "You've been paying rent to live in my house, except the money's been going into your wife's private account instead of to me." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see David's mind working, processing what I just said, trying to make sense of it. Heather, meanwhile, looked like she might be sick. "That's not," she started, then stopped. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I said calmly. "I understand that you've been stealing from your own husband while treating me like hired help in my own home. I understand that you convinced my son to pay for a mortgage that doesn't exist while you humiliated me at my own table." David was staring at Heather now, and she was staring at the ground. The pieces were falling into place for him, and I could see the moment when he understood the full scope of what had been happening. "Heather," he said quietly, "is this true?" She looked up at him, her eyes wide and desperate. "David, you don't understand. I was trying to help. I was saving the money for us, for our future." "You were stealing," he said flatly. "From me? From my mother?" "I wasn't stealing." Heather's voice rose to a near shriek. "I was protecting our interests. Your mother doesn't need this house. She's old. She should be in a retirement home anyway. We're young. We have children. We deserve." She stopped abruptly, realizing what she just said. But it was too late. The words were out there hanging in the air like toxic smoke. David looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "We deserve what Heather too steal from my mother, to treat her like a servant in her own home." "That's not—" "That's exactly what you meant." His voice was cold now, colder than I'd ever heard it. "You thought you could push her out, take over her house, and she'd just, disappear?" Heather's composure cracked completely. She spun toward me, her face twisted with fury. "This is your fault. You turned him against me. You're a bitter old woman who can't stand to see other people happy." I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had made my life miserable for 10 years, who had systematically tried to erase me from my own family. And I felt nothing. No anger, no hurt, no satisfaction, just a deep, abiding peace. "I didn't turn him against you, Heather," I said quietly. "You did that all by yourself." That's when she fainted. It happened so suddenly that no one was prepared for it. One moment, she was standing there screaming at me, and the next, she was crumpling to the porch floor like a marionette with cut strings. Nanny Kate gasped and stepped back. Ethan started crying. David just stood there, staring down at his unconscious wife. "Well," I said, stepping back into my kitchen, "I suppose you'd better call an ambulance." But David wasn't looking at Heather anymore. He was looking at me, and his eyes were full of something I hadn't seen in years. "Respect, Mom," he said softly. "I'm so sorry." I nodded acknowledgement but didn't respond. Sorry was a start, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. "Can we talk?" he asked. After we dealt with this situation, I looked at him, my son, the little boy I'd raised with such hope and love, who had grown into a man who'd allowed his wife to abuse his mother for years. He looked smaller now, diminished somehow, as if the revelation of Heather's deception had physically shrunk him. "We can talk," I said finally, "but not today." Today you need to figure out where you're going to stay. His face fell. Mom, please. We don't have anywhere else to go. You have money. I pointed out all that money Heather had been stealing from him. I'm sure she can afford a hotel until you sort things out. David opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. He looked down at his wife, who was starting to stir on the porch floor, then back at me. The children, he said quietly. What about Sophie and Ethan? I felt my resolve waver for just a moment. My grandchildren, innocent in all this, didn't deserve to be punished for their parents' mistakes. But I also couldn't allow them to be used as emotional leverage the way they'd been used to manipulate me for years. The children can visit, I said carefully, when you're ready to have a real conversation about respect and boundaries. But not today. Sophie appeared beside me, having finished in the bathroom. She looked up at me with those big, trusting eyes. Grandma Linda, why is Mommy sleeping on the porch? I knelt down to her level, smoothing her hair back from her face. Your mommy just got a little overwhelmed, sweetheart. She'll be fine. Are we not living here anymore? She asked, and I could hear the fear in her small voice. I chose my words carefully. Your house arrangements are going to change, honey. But that doesn't mean I love you any less. You'll always be my granddaughter, no matter where you live. She hugged me then, fierce and tight, and I held her close, breathing in her little girl scent of sunshine and bubblegum. When I looked up, I saw David watching us with tears in his eyes. By the time the paramedics arrived, Heather was conscious but hysterical. She kept insisting that I'd drugged her, that I'd somehow orchestrated the whole thing, that this was all part of some elaborate revenge plot. The paramedics, professional and kind, suggested she might be suffering from exhaustion and stress. Vacation can be overwhelming, one of them said gently. Sometimes the transition back to reality is harder than we expect. As they loaded Heather into the ambulance for observation, she grabbed David's hand. Don't let her do this to us, she pleaded. Fight for our family. Fight for our home. David looked at her with an expression I couldn't quite read. This isn't our home, Heather, he said quietly. It never was. That was the moment I knew things had truly changed. Not because I'd taken back my house, not because I'd revealed Heather's deception, but because my son had finally opened his eyes. As the ambulance pulled away and the family climbed back into their SUV to follow it to the hospital, I stood on my porch watching them go. The autumn air was crisp and clean, and for the first time in years, I could breathe freely. Mrs. Wallace appeared at her fence, obviously having watched the whole drama unfold. Everything all right over there, Linda? She called. I looked at my house. My beautiful, reclaimed house, with its comfortable furniture and family photos, and the smell of good coffee lingering in the kitchen. I thought about the morning ahead, quiet and peaceful, with no one to please but myself. Everything's perfect, I called back, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I meant it. 3 days passed before David came to see me alone. 3 days of silence that I filled with simple pleasures I'd forgotten existed. I read entire books without interruption, cooked meals I actually wanted to eat, and slept through the night without the low-level anxiety that had become my constant companion. On Wednesday evening, just as I was settling down with a cup of tea and the evening news, I heard his car in the driveway. This time, there was no rattling of keys, no angry voices, just a gentle knock on my front door. When I opened it, David stood there, looking like he'd aged 5 years in 3 days. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair uncombed, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult conversations. Mom, he said quietly. Can we talk? I stepped aside to let him in, noting how he paused in the doorway to take in the changes, the comfortable furniture, the family photos back on their walls. The general sense of a home that belonged to someone who actually lived there, rather than someone trying to impress visitors. It looks good, he said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like relief. It looks like home. I gestured toward the sofa. Sit down, I'll make coffee. As I moved around the kitchen, I could feel him watching me. The silence between us wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of two people who needed to find their way back to each other across a chasm that had been years in the making. How's Heather? I asked, though I wasn't sure I really wanted to know. David sighed deeply. She's not handling this well. The doctor says it's a severe stress reaction, but between you and me, I think it's more than that. I think she's realizing that everything she thought she had control over is slipping away. I brought him his coffee, made the way he'd liked it since he was a teenager. 2 sugars, a splash of cream. The fact that I still remembered seemed to surprise him. Where are you staying? I asked. The Fairfield Inn on Route 12. It's not ideal with the kids, but it's temporary. He paused, staring into his coffee cup. At least I hope it's temporary. I settled into my reading chair across from him. That depends on what temporary means to you. He looked up at me then, and I saw the boy he used to be underneath the exhausted man he'd become. Mom, I need you to know how sorry I am. Not just about the house or the money, but about everything. About how I let her treat you, about how I stood by and watched you disappear from your own life. Why did you? The question had been burning in me for years. Why did you let it happen? David was quiet for a long time, working his jaw, the way he used to when he was a child, trying to figure out how to explain something difficult. At first, I thought she was just particular. You know, she had opinions about how things should be done, and I figured that was normal for newlyweds. Everyone has to adjust. He set his coffee cup down with shaking hands. Then it became about keeping the peace. Every time I stood up for you, we'd have these terrible fights. She'd cry, tell me I was choosing my mother over my wife, make me feel guilty for not supporting her. I knew that pattern. The tears, the guilt, the way abusers turn their victims into accomplices. And then David continued, his voice getting quieter. I started believing her. She was so confident, so sure of herself. When she said you were too involved in our lives, when she said you needed to learn boundaries, when she said you were holding me back from growing up, I started thinking maybe she was right. The admission hung between us like a confession in church. She made me feel like loving you was a weakness, he said, and his voice cracked on the words, like being close to my mother was something to be ashamed of. I felt tears prick at my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of finally hearing my son acknowledge what I'd known, but couldn't prove for so many years. The money, I said carefully. How long has that been going on? David laughed bitterly. 6 years. 6 years of me writing checks for a mortgage that didn't exist. And I never questioned it. She handled all the finances, said it was easier that way. I was so busy with work, so tired when I came home. I just trusted her. What will you do now? He looked around the room again at the photos of his childhood, at the comfortable furniture that invited relaxation instead of demanding perfection. I don't know. I've been thinking about that for 4 days straight, and I honestly don't know. What do you want to do? The question seemed to surprise him. What do I want? Yes. Not what you should do, not what's expected of you, not what will cause the least conflict. What do you want? He was quiet again, thinking. Outside, I could hear Mrs. Wallace's dog barking at something in the yard, the normal sounds of a neighborhood settling into evening. I want my kids to know their grandmother. he said finally. Really know her, not just see her on holidays when their mother remembers to be polite. I want them to learn to cook from you the way I did. I want Sophie to hear your stories about when I was little, and I want Ethan to help you in the garden next spring. He paused, looking directly at me. And I want to remember who I was before I spent 10 years trying to be someone else's version of a good husband. What about Heather? The question I'd been avoiding, the one that would determine everything else. David stared at his hands. She's threatening to take the kids if I don't fight you on the house. Says she'll prove you're an unfit grandmother, that you're too old to be around children unsupervised. His voice hardened. She's also threatening to claim I abused her, that the stress of living with you drove her to steal the money as some kind of survival mechanism. I felt a chill run through me. Do you think she'll follow through? I think Heather will do whatever she has to do to get what she wants. And what she wants is this house, your money, and complete control over the family narrative. He looked up at me with something that might have been resolve, but I'm not going to let her have any of those things. The simple statement carried more weight than a dozen apologies. What does that mean? Practically speaking, I asked, it means I'm filing for divorce. It means I'm going to fight for custody of my children, and I'm going to make sure they know the truth about what happened here. It means I'm going to pay back every penny she stole with interest, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows that this house belongs to you and always has. I studied his face, looking for signs that he was just telling me what I wanted to hear. But what I saw was determination, the same stubborn streak that had gotten him through childhood challenges and helped him build his business. That won't be easy, I said. No, it won't. She's already started calling my business associates, telling them I've had some kind of breakdown. She's been on social media painting herself as the victim of elder abuse, claiming you've manipulated me into turning against her. He managed a weak smile. But you know what? I don't care anymore. I'm tired of living in fear of what she might do or say. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our coffee and processing everything that had been said. Finally, David spoke again. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. I nodded. Do you think you can forgive me? Not right away. I know I don't deserve that, but eventually. Do you think we can find our way back to each other? I looked at my son, this man who had hurt me so deeply, but who was finally trying to make it right. I thought about the years of small humiliations, the slow erosion of my place in his life, the way I'd been made to feel like an intruder in my own family. But I also thought about the little boy who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, who brought me dandelions from the yard like they were roses, who told everyone at school that his mom was the smartest person in the world. You're already forgiven, I said, and meant it. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean going back to the way things were. I wouldn't want to go back, David said quickly. I want to go forward. I want to build something new, something honest. Then that's what we'll do. He smiled. Then the first real smile I'd seen from him in years. It transformed his face, made him look like my son again, instead of a stranger wearing his skin. Can I ask you something else? He said. I nodded. When you changed those locks, when you sold the furniture, when you decided to take your house back, were you scared? I considered the question terrified, I admitted. But you know what I realized? I'd been scared for years. Scared of rocking the boat, scared of causing conflict, scared of being seen as the difficult mother-in-law. Fear was making all my decisions anyway. At least this way I was scared while doing something that mattered to me. David laughed, and it was a sound I'd missed more than I'd realized. That's the most badass thing I've ever heard you say. Language I said automatically, then laughed too. We talked for another hour, making tentative plans for the future. David would bring the children by this weekend. If that was all right with me, we would start slowly rebuilding trust and establishing new boundaries. He would pay me rent for the mortgage money Heather had stolen, not because I needed it, but because it was the right thing to do. As he got ready to leave, David paused at the door. "Mom, that card Heather gave you at Thanksgiving, the one about house sitting. What about it?" I had no idea she was planning that. If I had known, I would have stopped it. I believed him. The David I'd raised would never have intentionally humiliated me like that. The David who had let it happen was a man who had lost himself in someone else's version of love. "I know," I said, "but in a way, I'm grateful she did it." Grateful, I smiled, thinking about everything that had changed since that awful dinner. If she hadn't pushed me that far, I might never have found the courage to push back. After David left, I sat in my quiet house feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope that things might somehow get better if I just tried harder to be perfect, but real hope grounded in the knowledge that I had choices, that I had power, that I could shape my own life. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Heather would fight dirty, and there would be difficult days when the children missed their mother, or when David wavered in his resolve. But for the first time in years, I felt equipped to handle whatever came next. I was no longer the woman who had sat at that Thanksgiving table accepting humiliation with a forced smile. I was Linda Grace Thompson, and this was my house, my life, my choice, and that made all the difference. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen on a Saturday morning, teaching Sophie how to make my famous chocolate chip pancakes. The same recipe I taught David when he was her age. The same kitchen where 3 generations of my family had learned that cooking was about more than just food. It was about love, tradition, and taking care of the people who mattered to you. The secret is not to overmix the batter, I told her as she stirred with careful concentration. "A few lumps are perfectly fine." Sophie nodded seriously, taking her role as my apprentice very seriously. At 10, she was old enough to understand that something important had changed in our family dynamic, even if she didn't grasp all the details. What she did understand was that she now got to spend every other weekend with Grandma Della, learning recipes and hearing stories and being loved without conditions. Ethan, and now 8, was in the living room building an elaborate fortress out of couch cushions. He was younger, more adaptable, and had accepted the new arrangements with the resilience of childhood. His laughter echoed through the house, a sound that had been absent for too long. "Grandma," Sophie said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Daddy says Mommy is getting better." Is that true? I considered my answer carefully. Heather was indeed getting better in the clinical sense. She'd been receiving treatment for what her doctors diplomatically called adjustment disorder, with mixed anxiety and depressed mood. The reality was messier and more complex, involving medication therapy and a slow, grudging acceptance that the world she'd tried to create through manipulation and control had crumbled beyond repair. "Your mommy is working very hard to feel better," I said truthfully. "And that's good for everyone." The divorce had been finalized 2 months ago. David had been generous in the settlement, more generous than Harold Miller had advised, but I understood his reasoning. He wanted a clean break, wanted to start fresh without the bitter taste of a prolonged legal battle. Heather had moved back to her parents' house in Connecticut, and the children spent 2 weekends a month with her, carefully supervised visits that everyone hoped would eventually become more natural. I'd been worried about how Sophie and Ethan would handle the separation, but children are remarkably resilient when the adults in their lives are honest with them. David had sat them down and explained in age-appropriate terms that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that hurt the people they love, and that sometimes the best way to fix those mistakes is to make big changes. Will you and Daddy get back together? Sophie had asked during one of our early weekend visits. No, sweetheart, I told her. But that doesn't mean your family is broken. It just means your family looks different now. And it did look different. David had moved into a small rental house just 10 minutes away. Close enough that the children could ride their bikes to visit me, but far enough that we all had our own space. He came by most Sunday mornings for coffee and conversation. Sometimes staying for lunch, rebuilding our relationship one careful conversation at a time. The business was thriving. Free from Heather's expensive tastes and her constant pressure to maintain appearances, David had been able to focus on the work he actually enjoyed rather than chasing prestigious clients who drained his energy and his resources. He looked healthier now, less stressed, more like the son I remembered. Grandma, Ethan's voice called from the living room. Can you come see my castle? I wiped my hands on my apron and went to admire his architectural masterpiece. The entire living room had been transformed into an elaborate kingdom of cushions and blankets, with towers and bridges and secret passages that only an 8-year-old mind could envision. This is magnificent, I said and meant it. Are you the king of this castle? No, Ethan said solemnly. You are. You're the queen, and Sophie's the princess, and Daddy's the knight who protects us from dragons. I felt my throat tighten with emotion. In Ethan's innocent world-building, I was the queen, not the servant, not the inconvenience, not the person who should be grateful for scraps of attention. The queen. That's a very important job, I said. Seriously, what are my royal duties? Ethan thought about this carefully. You have to make sure everyone has enough pancakes, and you have to tell stories about when Daddy was little, and you have to give the best hugs in the kingdom. I think I can handle that, I said, gathering him into my arms for a demonstration of my royal hugging abilities. The front door opened, and David walked in carrying a bouquet of flowers from his garden. Daffodils and tulips, the first blooms of spring. It had become his tradition bringing me flowers every Sunday, a small gesture that meant more than he probably realized. Something smells amazing in here, he said, hanging his jacket on the coat rack I'd moved back to its original position by the door. Sophie's making pancakes, I announced proudly. She's becoming quite the chef. Sophie beamed at the praise, flipping a pancake with the concentration of a surgeon. She'd inherited the family cooking gene, that same instinctive understanding of flavors and timing that had skipped her father entirely. We ate breakfast together at my kitchen table, the four of us fitting comfortably around the reclaimed wood surface I'd chosen to replace Heather's formal dining set. The conversation flowed easily. Sophie's upcoming school play, Ethan's soccer practice, David's plans to expand his business, my new book club at the library. It was ordinary and perfect, and nothing like the tense performance-based meals we'd endured for so many years. After breakfast, David helped with the dishes while the children returned to their various projects. We worked in comfortable silence, falling back into the rhythm we'd had when he was young. And it was just the two of us against the world. Mom, he said quietly, drawing a plate with careful attention. I've been thinking about something. What's that? The money the mortgage payments Heather took. I know I've been paying you back, but I was thinking, what if we made it official? What if I actually paid you rent to live here again? I paused in my scrubbing. David, you have your own place now. I know, but the kids love being here, and honestly, so do I. Not full-time. He added quickly. I'm not asking to move back in completely, but maybe we could work out an arrangement where I stay here a couple nights a week when the kids are here for their weekends. I considered this. The house was large enough. Certainly the spare bedroom had been empty since I'd sold Heather's guest room furniture, and it would be nice to have more help with the children. But more than that, It would be a return to something that felt like family, like the 3 generations sharing space and stories and daily life. What would that look like? I asked. I was thinking Friday and Saturday nights when the kids are here. Maybe Sunday nights too, if that works for you. I'd pay my share of utilities, help with groceries, take care of any maintenance issues. He paused. And I'd follow your house rules. Your house, your rules. The phrase that had once been a source of conflict now felt like a gift, like an acknowledgement of something that should have been obvious all along. I'd like that, I said simply, his face lit up with relief and joy. Really? Really? But we'll need to establish some boundaries, clear expectations about how this works. Absolutely. Whatever you think is best. We talked through the details over the next hour, working out a schedule and ground rules that would protect everyone's independence while allowing us to rebuild the family structure that had been damaged, but not destroyed. It felt good to be making plans, to be looking forward instead of backward. That afternoon, while David took the children to the park, I sat in my garden with a cup of tea and the Sunday paper. The roses I'd planted decades ago were beginning to bud, and the herb garden was showing the first green shoots of spring growth. Everything was coming back to life after a long, difficult winter. Mrs. Patterson waved from her yard where she was hanging laundry on the line she'd stubbornly maintained, despite her children's offers to buy her a modern dryer. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" she called. "Perfect." I called back and meant it. My phone buzzed with a text message. For just a moment, my stomach clenched with the old anxiety. For months after the confrontation, Heather had sent a steady stream of angry, manipulative messages, trying to guilt me into giving up the house, promising revenge, threatening legal action that never materialized. But Harold Miller had finally convinced her lawyer that harassment charges were a real possibility, and the messages had stopped. This text was from my daughter-in-law, Sandra, my older son, David's wife, who lived across the country in Oregon. "I've heard from Marcus about everything that's been happening. So proud of you for standing up for yourself. Can't wait to visit this summer and see the new and improved family dynamic." I smiled, typing back a quick response. David had been horrified when he'd learned the full story of what had been happening, full of apologies for not intervening, for not seeing what was right in front of him during his infrequent visits. But I'd forgiven him too, understanding that it's easier to see dysfunction from the inside than from 3,000 miles away. The sound of children's laughter drifted from the park down the street where Marcus was pushing Jake on the swings while Emma practiced cartwheels in the grass. My family different now, but stronger. Smaller, but more authentic. I thought about that terrible Thanksgiving dinner 6 months ago, about the humiliation I'd felt reading that card, about the woman I'd been grateful for scraps, accepting cruelty as the price of family connection, making herself smaller and smaller to accommodate other people's comfort. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth, who understood that love without respect was not love at all, who had learned that the most important person to stand up for was herself. The house around me was quiet and peaceful, filled with furniture I'd chosen, decorated with memories I cherished, organized according to my preferences rather than someone else's vision of perfection. It was home in the truest sense of the word, not just because I owned it legally, but because I inhabited it fully without apology or compromise. As the sun began to set, painting the kitchen in golden light, I started planning the week ahead book club on Tuesday lunch, with an old friend on Wednesday, Emma's school play on Friday. Simple pleasures, but they were mine by choice rather than by default. Marcus and the children would be back soon, full of stories about their afternoon adventures, ready for dinner and homework and the comfortable chaos of family life. I would listen to their stories, help with math problems, tuck my grandchildren into beds in rooms that welcomed them without conditions. And later, after the children were asleep and Marcus had gone back to his own place, I would sit in my reading chair with a good book and a cup of tea, surrounded by the peace I had fought for and won. The card that had started it all was long gone, burned to ash in my fireplace months ago. But I would never forget its message, or the moment it had awakened something fierce and necessary inside me. Thank you for your service had been meant as an insult, a dismissal, a cruel reminder of my place in their hierarchy. Instead, it had become my liberation, because I had served my family, my children, my own conscience, with dedication and love for decades. And I deserved better than being treated like hired help in my own home. Now I was serving myself, serving my own happiness and peace of mind and sense of dignity. And that I had learned was the most important service of all. The front door opened with the happy chaos of returning adventurers. Emma burst into the kitchen full of stories about the ducks in the pond. Jake announced that he was starving, and could we please have grilled cheese for dinner? Marcus followed behind them, looking relaxed and content in a way I hadn't seen in years. "How was your afternoon, Mom?" He asked the same question he'd asked every Sunday since we'd started rebuilding our relationship. "Perfect," I said, meaning it completely. Absolutely perfect. And as I started pulling ingredients from the refrigerator for grilled cheese and tomato soup, surrounded by the people who loved me and the home that truly belonged to me, I knew that I had finally, after 65 years, learned the most important lesson of all. I was enough. I had always been enough, and I would never, ever accept less than I deserved again. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.